Welcome to The Wanderers, a branch of the Collage podcast that is a production of Feed My Sheep. Feed My Sheep is a nonprofit in Temple, Texas that has a goal of feeding people that are hungry physically, spiritually, and emotionally. In this podcast, we discuss Scripture, and our hope is that you would be fed spiritually through the reading and discussing of His Word. Hello, and welcome to the Feed My Sheep podcast. We are glad that you're here with us today. I am here with Jeff and Roy, and Bobby is joining us from behind the camera. We're glad he's here with us to give us insight into this text. And so today we will start reading. I'll be in Matthew 18, verses 1 through 6. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And he called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, "Truly, I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea."
And the parallel passage in Mark is in Mark chapter 9, verse 33 through 37. They came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, they asked him, "What were you arguing about on the road?" But they kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "Anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all." And he took a little child whom he had placed among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me."
Luke chapter 9, verses 46 through 48. An argument started among them about who was the greatest of them. But Jesus, knowing their inner thoughts, took a little child and had him stand next to him. He told them, "Whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes him who sent me. For whoever is least among you, this one is great."
Who do you think started the argument?
Peter.
Always Peter. I don't know. James and John don't have the best track record of this.
I disagree. I think people who feel important aren't the ones who are going to draw attention to it. So this is the same chapter, at least in Mark. This is after the Transfiguration. So Peter, James, and John are feeling, like that they know that about themselves. They're not going to say anything. So I'm thinking it's one of the others who didn't get invited,
Are annoyed
on that little trip. Yeah, I wonder if one of them makes a snide, sarcastic comment or something, and that's kind of what starts it, like insecurity, coming out. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It wouldn't be Peter.
You don't think so?
No, he doesn't need to.
I don't know.
I could see the power struggle between Peter and James and John, two kind of vying for, but I get to sit by him, in the other passage. And then I was there at the Transfiguration. Well, I was there.
Yeah, but you screwed it up, Peter.
Yeah, so that's why I think it's one of them, because it says an argument. So obviously there's more than one that feel pretty passionately about it.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. Peter's like, no, he said I was a rock. You're like, yeah, and then he called you Satan. I mean, I love reading Scripture and just seeing my own and our own humanity just right there on the page.
I love the way Mark says it. So, writing-wise, most people think, it was written by John Mark, but that it was the words of Peter dictated to him. And so if you think about Peter saying this, "Hey, write this down," when they were in the house, he asked us, "What were you arguing about on the road?" But we kept quiet because we had argued about who was the greatest.
Yeah, it's like, oh yeah,
Oh, you heard that?
Right? It's like so embarrassing. Oops. But I kind of love that about Mark, that he in this gospel, Peter, I mean, if he is the one dictating all of this, there is a sense that he's like totally admits, like, we were idiots, and this is what we were arguing about. We were constantly doesn't paint them in the best of light.
Yeah. But it's still, I mean, even if they realize that there's something about this argument that's ridiculous or that's shameful, that, is embarrassing, it still speaks to this desire we have of being important, being seen, and if their belief at this moment, not really maybe fully knowing what it is that they're grasping at, is that they have hitched their wagon to a winner, that he is the Messiah, he is the chosen one of God. Nobody else in the world knows this, and we do. Like, we know what's going to happen. We're on the winning team, and we're in his inner circle. And so certainly our position in this world is about to radically change. And so it's not like you're less important. It's like, no, we're all getting cabinet positions here. But who gets to be the right-hand man, or who gets the, who really, what is that hierarchy going to look like? And what's interesting is some church traditions actually answer this question. The Catholic tradition, which all of us, whether we acknowledge it or not, has informed, all other faith Christian traditions in the West, is that the answer was Peter, that he does take a place of primacy among the other apostles, and so that's why you have the Pope is sort of he's in the seat of Peter. So it's just interesting.
It's interesting to me, especially in Mark. So if you see this passage, and we're really only looking at just a few verses, but if you take a step back, 3 times Jesus predicts his death, shows them something about the kingdom that they don't think, this is the way that it's going. Like, I feel like he's trying to reveal the kingdom is upside down. It's not what you expect. It's about the least of these, and I'm actually going to be this suffering servant that is going to die. And they don't get it, but if you look, it's Mark 8, Mark 9, and Mark 10, 3 times over and over, and they are not getting it, but it's all right before Jerusalem too. Like, I feel like an anxiety for Jesus in this moment of like, they are not getting it. And oh my gosh, he knows what's coming. Like, they have not a clue what they are about to walk into, but also what he's asking them to become. The human side of me imagines if I was leading them, I would be annoyed. Of just like, man, I'm trying to get this through to you. It's not about the greatest. And
I will say this out loud. I say it all the time. Like, I feel for Jesus in this one. I can't feel for him. I can understand, like what you're saying, that he would be frustrated in the midst of what's going on, because he knows completely what he is doing and where he is going. He's got people around him that he's trusting. And so, like, here I always joke, and I mean this nicely, it's just me, like in leadership, I always tell Casey, the death of me will not be the people we serve, it's the people who work on the same cause. And they are the ones that kill you. And you go, I cannot believe this person has been around this long and they've missed the mark that badly.
Maybe that's what they were arguing about.
Could be, and
You know?
like it could be like in that you're going in that because he's told them like if they're still thinking, man, we're fixing to be royalty, and how many times do I have to tell them you're not? You're going to suffer and you're going to go through some terrible things, but it's for a greater thing, and you're still worried about you don't get it, and so he's I kind of look at it on the other way. He's like, he's not crud, but he's like, man, I've already hitched my wagon to these horses. I got to drag them across. Like, because I'm already with this group. I can't go ahead and get a whole new batch of disciples this close to, he could. But so like in it, I'm like, it would be frustrating for him. Not that he got to frustrating, but it must have crossed his mind because he wouldn't have gone back to a conversation that occurred and said, hey, by the way, what were y'all talking about back there? Mm-hmm. You don't go back to teachable moments unless you have a point to teach, and they were of utmost importance. So mine is, I'm sure there was other conversations they were talking about, oh, whatever. That time I caught 52,000 fish over in such and such a sea. He didn't go back and talk about that. He said, why were y'all arguing? What was the conversation about?
Yeah.
And again, to go, again, you don't get it.
Wait, Bobby, you got what were you gonna say?
I don't think I started to speak, but I do have a thought.
Please speak. I thought I heard you.
So, in the Matthew telling, he says, "Whoever humbles himself like this child, this one is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." And I think that really addresses where their heart was. It was just pride, and he keeps telling them to elevate others, each other, above themselves, and that's what the kingdom of heaven is about.
Yeah. And in Mark, before he brings the kid in, the greatest is going to be, the servant. To be, if you want to be great, you got to be a servant. You got to be a servant of all. The first must become the very last.
But I find it interesting, like on this one, like on that, and maybe my parenting experience a little bit different, or I don't know. I don't know if there's a more selfish organism on the planet Earth other than a young child.
Yeah. So if you take a 4-year-old's perception of themselves in the world and you put it in an adult body, what you end up with is a psychopath.
Yeah.
Like just pure narcissism. It's about what they need in the present moment, and yeah. So what is it? But then he is it Matthew where he you take the lowly position of a child. So what is that child signify? And I'm gonna guess that the standing of a child. I know a little bit that the standing of a child societally and in people's imaginations is very different than the way that we think of kids. Our children are our pride and joy, and we talk about them all the time, and they're just the neatest things in the world, or they're giving us a headache or whatever. But it's a very different, like social standing in Jesus's world.
One of the things I had read in a commentary was just about the first century Roman world. Children, like, they were loved and valued in terms of inheritance and knowing, like, what I have will be passed on to this child. And that, like, maybe brought pride and joy to them. But at the same time, kids were not physically powerful. They were economically dependent. Nothing in politics, subject to a lot of violence at that time. And I think when I think about, I guess, what is it that I hear Jesus trying to say? What I hear is children are dependent. They don't know how, they cannot clothe themselves often without help. They cannot feed themselves without help. Every basic need, they're dependent on somebody else to provide that. And I wonder if that's partly what Jesus is saying here, is like, you have to stop being so self-sufficient if you want to be in my kingdom. Like, you have to learn how to depend on me and the one who sent me.
And that's interesting. Like, for me, the story shouldn't, but for me, if he's holding an infant, the story is very different to me than if he's holding a 4-year-old.
Sure.
Because like I've seen the stat, and so I'm looking. What am I seeing? It's not Goofy, the statue that's in front of a downtown church here in Temple. It's Jesus enacting this, and he's got a 4 or 5-year-old child. So then that's imprinted in my head. Oh, this is the story. Well, no, that might not have been. So mine, if you go, what a great teaching metaphor, and if he used it, it was. So whatever he did was absolutely great. But if he's holding a little baby and go, look, this is what it means right here.
The Luke passage does say the child stood next to him.
Oh,
There
okay.
you go.
Fair.
Yeah.
So he's probably at least what? When do they stand?
Toddler at least.
Yeah.
Fair.
Yeah, it's for the context is this question of like standing though. I mean, not like social standing, greatness versus something else, versus just like lowliness, and so the dependence and the kind of the need for a child to be in the care of somebody else and to look to somebody else to have their needs met. I think is that's a really powerful image for discipleship and our dependence on the Lord. But also, I don't want us to lose the contrast here that this is also about not. I mean, kids just not aware or have no awareness of who's better, who's lesser than. They're not even really reckoned that way or measured that way in society. I mean, you'll have your aristocratic kids who may know that they have more money than the slave kids, but I wonder if this childlikeness is also a disregard or a forgetfulness of our place in the world and a giving up of our desire to be measured that way and to be better than other people. I don't know. There's when we read scripture. And if we're doing like exegetical work, there are two ways to look at a text. And one is the way that we're looking at it, where the situation that's relevant for understanding this is the situation that's depicted in the scripture, where it's about the disciples and it's about their argument. But another question we ask is, what was going on in the Christian community at the time that Mark or Matthew or Luke is writing this, that they emphasize this point, or they remember Jesus's teaching, and is there something happening in that early church that makes this text relevant to that community? And so I wonder what. Again, I see our humanity on the page. Just I wonder how in that early church these questions of greatness, these questions of standing and who's important. I wonder how they're manifesting. That Mark is like, or Peter, dictating or whatever, is like, hey, we need to remember. We need to remember this moment because I think our folks need to hear this from Jesus too.
So I looked up a cross-reference, and Jesus talked about some of who would be least or greater in the kingdom of heaven. Earlier, Matthew 5 says, "Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." So Jesus has already brought up this topic to them before about some people being greater or lesser.
Yeah. Okay. So it's not. This isn't. We can't say that what Jesus is saying is that there is no reckoning of who's greater than others. Like there are some measures or things that he's giving us to aspire to.
And even when he answers their question in the passages we just read, he doesn't say, "Oh no, everyone's equal."
Yeah.
Yeah, and then what do you do with that? What you just introduced? Hey, you're the least in heaven. Okay, I'll take that. I mean, like if I can get the least, and you're the greatest in heaven.
Yeah. What's the
There's
psalm?
a differentiating area
Yeah.
in heaven.
I'd rather be, was it a
doorman
a doorman in the house of the Lord. Yeah. But is that something, is he using that language to help us orient to what's really important? And maybe there's a differentiation of reward or whatever, but no, if you want to be great, okay, we all want to be great, right? So if you want to be great in the kingdom, then this is what this looks like. And he's using that language to point to how we should be and to help us to shift our mindset of what it actually looks like. I want to be great in the kingdom. If he's appealing to my ego there, then I'm going to do what he says. And then what he says is become last, be a servant, be humble, give up this stuff. And that's really powerful rhetorically anyway.
Sorry, go ahead, Karen.
I was just going to say, I wonder if some of it is the faith like a child. That children often may obey and blindly follow the one that they love without a whole lot of pushback and a whole lot of, well, why can't I drive today? You don't usually hear that from a 4-year-old that's excited to go somewhere with their dad.
Yeah, I was leaving the house. This was yesterday. I was leaving the house, and my 3-year-old, it was like a full-on like koala hug because I was leaving, and just arms, legs, and then refusing to let go. And he's like, can I go to work with you? No. Okay. I have to wait till I'm 16. Can I go to work with you when I'm 16? I don't know where he got 16 from. Sure. When you're 16, you can come to work with me. But this desire to be with me and do what I do. Man, that's a beautiful image.
I was just thinking, if we think of the kingdom of heaven in the literal sense of Christ being king, if God's king of our lives, then by definition, for us to be the greatest in that, we have to be more submissive. Mm-hmm. He has to be more of a king for us to be greater in his kingdom. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Did I say that right?
Yeah, I think so.
There's a great book that I love. It's a fiction, kind of historical Christian fiction, I guess would be the genre, but it's called A Week in the Life of a Greco-Roman Woman by a lady named Holly Beers. And it goes, it's been a little bit since I read it. I think it was set in Ephesus, but it's just going through like your average life of a woman at that time. But in the story, she meets a woman that invites her to this house church where Paul is. And the thing that I've never been able to get out of my head is the utter shock when she walks into the house church and they're sitting and they're eating together. But it's this upside down kingdom. And she's from this community, so she knows some of these people. And she's like, this person is the master of that slave. And they were just like, can I get you more food? And like got up and went to wherever to get them more. Like the master serving the slave, the husband who, more or less is the wife is the property of, he's serving the wife. And she's so disoriented by this scene where everybody walks in the room as an equal. And it's so different from outside of those walls enough that she's like, what is this? Like, I actually want to be a part of this. This is wild. But I wonder, just imaginatively, what would that look like for the children in the room? and sometimes we maybe at a dinner party might regulate kids to a smaller table or go, I'm guilty of this in my own home, when they were
Yeah.
little, or go play, let me talk, or things like that. And just the conviction to think, what would it look like if we pulled that 3-year-old up and let them have the microphone at the table for a moment and just said, what do you want to say? What, as silly or as whatever that might be, just
That they're a part of the life of the family or of the church or of whatever it is that's going on. Like, yeah, you're fully a part of this.
right. Giving them, agency in the kingdom. I'd also heard a podcast a couple weeks ago of a professor friend of mine, but she was interviewing a lady that works with intergenerational ministries and trying to pull different generations together. But one example that she gave that I've not been able to get also out of my head was a church that in an effort to bridge this generational gap, I don't know if it was a boy or girl, but it was a 12-year-old that was selected to be a part of the elder team because they recognized that this person is going to have a different view than the rest of us will. And man, I've thought about that a lot of just elder meetings that I'm aware of in past places that I've been, but how a child's presence would cause an accountability that would be wildly different than some things that I have seen. And how would that change leadership of churches if we opened spaces to that and just said, hey, you know Jesus too, and you have value, and we want to hear your voice in the kingdom.
What is interesting on like a whole other, we go down that road, like faith that I grew up in, there is what is considered an age of accountability. That before this age, you really can't make faith decisions on your own. I'm not saying I agree with that or disagree. Many faiths in the Christian, they would go, hey, before you can take the sacraments in this faith, you got to be this age. You got to go through this course. You got to be trained up.
What age is that?
I know.
Well, mine was sixth grade, your sixth
Okay.
grade year. Most are 13. Like that I would know of that. Others, around here. And then there's discussion. I'm not agreeing. So then out of that, that's totally out of this realm.
Right. I think there's like a church has to pick an orthopraxy to follow. And at the end of the day, the rubber meets the road and they're going to have to make some choices. But I also feel like there's such an arbitrary choice in that of, well, this denomination chooses 12 and this one chooses 18. And I'm over here, but like, what if this 8-year-old has 10 times the amount of faith that this older man does or whatever? And you see this, and Jesus in some sense is like, unless you have this humility of this child, you won't enter. And it makes me wonder how much more we should ask children's opinions.
Yeah. What are the questions that we sometimes ask in our churches that point to the reality that we don't see, whether it's children or other adults in different life circumstances, that we don't see each other as equal or as, we're talking about, he's talking to the disciples. They are going to have positions, or they're going to have leadership. They will have leadership and authority. So, what are the questions we ask that point to the attitudes that leaders have that there is a difference between this person versus that person, and then how do we modify those so that we're really seeking to be a servant?
I think the one I see in these 3 passages is humility. That's what to me keeps jumping out of the page. And even the shock that this scene must have been in their culture of, in some sense, I would imagine that at least the 12 men, even by their argument before, felt they deserved to be there. Like, in some sense, he called me. I'm the rock. I'm whatever, whatever has happened in their life, but he called me and I'm here. Therefore, I deserve to be here. But there's a humility that I don't think anybody in this scene expected the child to be the one elevated in that moment. The idea of like believing that you belong is one that I've wrestled with through seminary and watching different interactions. Often a theological discussion, most men will come to the table and never second guess their voice
Their place
or
at the table.
just like I'm here and I'm going to say, I might even interrupt and not notice. But almost every single woman I know in that situation is having two conversations, one about the theology and another one in her head being like, should I say this? I don't know. I'm unsure. I'm not sure if I deserve to be here ultimately, or if I have the chops to say something about this issue. And it actually, even in these three stories, I wonder, because I think about this a lot, I think there were women there. We know women follow Jesus. They are not specifically mentioned in this, but I think those women that followed him were there. At the very least, there's women in the crowd. But I wonder, like, what was going on in the women's minds to see this interaction of kind of a power play, and you've got these men arguing of who's the greatest, and then all of a sudden child's elevated and you're somewhere in between both of those in this status of society, and wondering, does this affect me? If the child gets a voice, do I? And do I have a place in this kingdom then, if the goal is to have the humility of this child? Do I then have agency in this moment? And I don't know, something I...
So if we are trying to formulate like a kind of a question for ourselves here, who, when we ask ourselves, or when there's a table, whatever that looks like, or when there's a conversation, who's invited, and on what basis are we replicating? Are we kind of replicating like the world's social structures in our like leadership conversations or important discussions? So who's invited? And what you were talking about when you were talking about humility, I know humility is it's a difficult thing, I think, for a person to kind of self-assess, like how humble am I? It always cracks me up when people, the tradition is that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and then there's that line or the first 5 books of the Bible, and that's the sort of Jewish tradition of that. And but then there is the line, I think it's in Numbers, or either Numbers or Deuteronomy, where it's like, and Moses was the most humble man who had ever lived, And so, like, he's like writing that about himself is, the tradition there.
Sounds very similar to today.
Yeah, but it is like if I'm trying to assess my my fitness to step up, and I want to serve somebody and I want to do it well, but I need to be aware of my own stuff. That one of those questions of fitness, and as a church, a question of fitness for who's a leader, it really does need to be humility.
I wonder if some of that goes back to the child's dependency, though. And so when I see like the Hebrew, I've not studied it a ton, but a little bit of the word humility. The best kind of well-rounded definition I can find is it's not thinking of yourself less, but it's thinking of yourself in right relationship to God and to other people. And so if I am less than God, I am not an equal with him. I see myself rightly as a follower of his, as somebody that bows to him as the king in the kingdom, and to other people as no better, no less either. Like we are all maybe equal in that sense. For me as a woman, I struggle with that. And like I said earlier, often come to the table, especially in discussions like this, feeling like the least of these, unsure of, I'm not sure that I have anything to offer in this moment. Who wants to hear my voice, like in this moment? But if I think about that definition of humility, I'm like, okay, no, if I'm in right relationship with God and he is the king that I'm following, then maybe I do have a place and a voice to speak in this moment. But I think my mind just keeps going back to, it makes me dependent. I'm dependent on the king, just like a child is dependent to be fed, to be clothed, to have a warm place to sleep at night. And a child cannot really move well without someone in its life taking care of them, whether it's a parent, whether it's a family member, a friend. Often that child, it's utterly dependent on somebody else. And I wonder if some of that is going with the humility of, maybe it's not so much about that child saying, I'm better than Johnny who's sitting next to me or whatever. Jesus is like, that's not the conversation. The child remembers that it's dependent. It's maybe that kid just said, hey, Mom, when's lunch? And Jesus is like, come here. You guys have fed people. You've fed 4,000, you've fed 5,000. But you've got to remember and be dependent, just like this kid, on me and on the king of the kingdom.
I think that's a great definition of humility, because the Bible doesn't say anywhere to just think that we're worthless or that God doesn't love us. Like, Jesus doesn't respond by saying, just think you're the lowest thing on earth, that sort of thing. And we see, so the disciples obviously were thinking of themselves too high, but with Moses, we see of him thinking of himself too low when God calls him to serve. And so obviously it comes down to dependence on God and trust in God.
Right.
Yeah. That's your definition. That definition of humility is great. Here is a less great version, just for kicks and giggles. It's a real preacher version of or definition.
Does it have 3 points?
No, but it does have some wordplay. So our English word humility does come from Latin. It comes from the word humus, which is in relation to dirt and soil. So it doesn't mean that you're dirt, but what grows in the soil. So our humility is our capacity. Like that's the requirement for growth, and for God to do new things in us. It is our is our humility.
Yeah, I think as a female, I've thought a lot just about this interaction with potential women that I think are there, even though they're not mentioned, and children, and just what was going on in the moms' minds as they are ones that are constantly taking care of the least of these, but even how that affects our kingdom today. In that, so much in our culture and our society, it's like, that's women's work. You take care of them so that I can go do big things at the office. And when I read this, I'm like, oh man, whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me and welcomes the one who sent me. And it spins a little bit about, for me at least, motherhood, and I would extend that to fatherhood, of the holy moments that we spend with our kids, especially in that dependent and state that they're in when they're younger, and just what holy, holy thing that is to take care of another human being that is utterly dependent on you. And the humility that that child has because of the dependence, but how that can be a beautiful thing. I think I mentioned a few weeks ago, I don't remember which podcast it was, but in taking care of my parents at the end of their life, and this flip of them becoming utterly dependent to the point of changing diapers, spoon feeding, and that they literally were utterly dependent on me for a few weeks of those last moments. But it is such holy work. And I mentioned in that moment that I had left this ministry position and was doing that and struggling with that, struggling with feeling like, well, I could be out there giving a talk to 20 high school kids about the gospel, but instead I'm here changing a diaper, and just the Spirit whispering, but this too, like this moment is holy. And I think that's a little bit of what Jesus is saying here. Like, you guys are over here arguing who gets to sit by me, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And I'm telling you that being with a child in this moment and humbling yourself to that status of taking care of them, these are holy moments. And this is what the kingdom is about.
Yeah, like that would be my slant. I mean, like this, to me, that's leadership 101. I mean, this is, if I was going to sit down, if Bobby's saying, hey, Jeff, tell me what it means to be a leader. Well, here you go. You know, this is it. And then what you just said like that is you gave up it to be first, like to truly lead and be an example. What did you do? You have to lower yourself even lower than what you even thought possible for the good of others. Mm-hmm. And so, like your parents, you had this love for them, and you're going, you know, if somebody would have said, Karen, job requirement, I need you to do that. No, thank you, I'm out. But by the sheer, it wasn't a task that you felt you had to accomplish. It was this overwhelming feeling of how much you cared for them, and then you did it out of right intentions of that, of going, no, of course I will do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then you led. And so that it was this moment, and then there was strength in that, not weakness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You chose to do this not because you expected to receive anything from it. There wasn't a task that was going, hey, Kay, if you do this for 3 months, you're going to give this position up, but you're going to get a bigger one. Mm-hmm. Anybody would do that. That's not leadership. Anybody would lead if you think you're going to get great benefits from it. Mm-hmm. You did it because not anybody who was there a big audience watching you? Maybe now on social media somebody would watch. No, nobody saw what you were doing other than the person you were serving.
Yeah,
that's leadership.
I think it's important too to remember that the king embodied himself and began in the form of this child. That like he is not asking us to do something that he has not done himself, from coming down all the way from heaven to literally making himself in the form of a child that was utterly dependent on Mary for the first at least few years of his life. But I would argue even further after that, you know, just the agency that he gave her by the embodiment of becoming her child and saying, I will allow you to change my diaper, to take care of me, I will humble myself as the king of the universe to a very young Jewish woman and allow her to take care of me. I find that just a really beautiful thing, especially in that he's not asking us to do something that he hasn't already done himself.
Yeah, I think if I had a landing spot, it'd be, you know, the Christian publishing world loves the phrase servant leadership. It sells books. And I think, I think that phrase, it resonates a little bit with the reality that some of us are trying to, are trying to lead in some way, but we want to lead in ways that honor Jesus and are listening to him. Your example, Karen, from earlier about, a 12-year-old sitting at a decision-making table, somebody had to make that decision and invite that child and empower that child and make sure that kid's voice is heard. There are people in our world, and in the context of Feed My Sheep, and in my church, we do see folks who their standing in the world just is so low in the eyes of society, and too often in their own eyes. And sometimes the assumption when people walk into a place like Feed My Sheep, or a place even into a church, is that I am coming here because I am dependent and I need and I'm coming to receive something that I need. And it does require sometimes somebody walking next to him and going, hey, I get that maybe the world works that way and sees you as somebody who is a recipient of other people's service. What are you good at? What do you love? How do you want to serve? We're making some choices here that may affect our. We're trying to figure out some ways of serving or serving our community better. You're a part of our community. Please teach us and help us make this decision well. And that is leadership. And it somebody has to be the person, or some bodies. And if the church leadership had that kind of mindset where one of our jobs, maybe a big job, is to actually equip the saints for the works of ministry, as Ephesians 4 tells us. What that means is that as people come in, our job is to help them be heard, help them see themselves not just as part of the gospel story in their own individual lives, but also part of the gospel story that's happening here in this place. And so you have the child sitting at the table, and you have this person sitting at the table, and maybe it looks more like that novel, that fictionalized account of the church in Ephesus that's upside down. But some people have to make choices to do things differently.
I think they have to give up power and status in that moment it takes humility to be inquisitive of others' voices, whether that's intergenerational, whether it's race, whether it's gender. All of that requires the person with the power to say, I want to hear from other voices. And maybe in this scenario, what does that look like for a child? For me, in seminary, one of the greatest gifts was kind of what you're describing, but it was the men and my peers in class, even sometimes to the point of maybe I was in a small group like this, 3 other guys, and they had become like brothers, but sometimes, would get like vocal, and they're all giving their opinion, and I'm shy about jumping in, and one of them says, hold up. I want to know what she thinks, what's going on in your mind right now. And it was so life-giving and agency-giving to have a guy say, hold up, like, I see that she hasn't spoken in 15 minutes. I genuinely want to know what's going on in her mind. And I wonder what would that look like for church leadership to do that with children in our churches, and children that love God and are following him to the best of their 4-year-old ability, or 12-year-old ability, or 18-year-old ability. And what would it look like for us to give up power and give agency to children and ask their opinion on the kingdom?
For me on this one, I'm not all that smart, so I have to take things down to a really small level. For me, I don't see a greater, bigger picture. I see for me, this is one I come back to time and time again. And so I look at it for me, and these are leaders. I mean, these were leaders that Jesus had with him. They were in positions. And so then he speaks to them, gets them aside. This is not to the whole everybody. He talks to them and says, you want to be a leader? Okay, again, I'm going to tell you what it is. And so for me, it says, Jeff, do you really want these things? You know, do you want to be a leader? And then anybody, I would say this, like for me, this is just Jeff 101. Anybody who says they want to be a leader, they do not understand at all what it means to be a leader. And they don't want it, and you don't want them as a leader, period. Okay, now you can take that for whatever it's worth, but some people are forced into positions you do have to lead. Okay, and he says, guess what? Here's what it is. You got to take the last position in the line. You know, and you got to put others first. Don't forget about yourself, but others go first. And these things that you may want. And it goes to the nth most degree possibly. And you're going, these other things and these other desires you have in your world, they may not be number one. And so like for me, and then to go like that. So if we were going to say, write a book about it on this scripture, I'd go, man, Kay's analogy, not of any of this story, but when I left everything behind to go take care of my parents, that's leadership. That's this. Okay, and so I don't get caught up in the discussion. What I do get frustrated on in this is we've had this for thousands of years. It's really neat that at least now in the modern day church and following of Christ that we don't struggle with the same issue now today.
For sure, yeah, absolutely.
It's so infuriating that it's in black and white, it's plain and simple. And I wasn't, and thank the Lord to everything that I was not Jesus, I would have been absolutely so frustrated. Because he knows while he's saying this, he knows what he's going to do. I mean, like in the Luke one, it's kind of funny because I'm fixing to go talk to the soccer guys, and we're simply going to talk. The verse further down is 9:51 in Luke, which is Jesus resolutely turned his eyes upon Jerusalem. Not too long after he says this, we're looking at 48 in that one, and then okay, whatever, and then he says, okay, so it's huge. Huge moment. He said, you want to lead? Here's what it's going to mean. And then in Luke, he turns his eyes resolutely, maybe my single favorite word in the whole dictionary is resolutely turned his eyes upon Jerusalem. So he knew full well what he was about to do, where he was going to go, and they weren't still going to get it. But yet, why did he do it? For their benefit, for our benefit, and nobody even understood what was going on other than him. Not that he kept it secret, like he made these things plain, so that's bad leadership. I'm going to keep everything secret and not let anybody know what's going on, and this is my little deal, because that's power. That's not good leadership. He told everybody plain and simple, here's what must occur. And so then not only did he say them and say, man, gosh, y'all don't get it. It's this. Put everybody else in front of your own needs. Okay, and is that easy? Absolutely not, because then you go further into Luke and all of them, what does he do at the end? He doesn't want to have to do what true leadership required of him. But then he said the magic sentence, which is, but you know what? I don't want my will, I want yours. So in it, all these leadership, and I'm with Roy, servant leadership, most overused and misunderstood term in church right now. Maybe that and forgiveness would be neck and neck in the competition.
That sounds like another podcast.
Yeah, but so in it, because we all would call ourselves on Sunday, we're servant leaders.
Yeah.
We're and we may, and I'm not going to judge anybody. That's not mine to judge their walk. I would desire to be one, but I know I am horrendously poor at it and very bad.
Yeah, you said something about like Jesus being, frustrated or disappointed, and it just made me think like, oh man, I wonder how many times like, just Roy, get out of your head, like get, stop.
But some of this, as if we're, because mine, what we're the scripture was more on leadership and less on the child, like was my take. And then out of this, and the child is huge, so I'm not taking anything out of that.
He was small. He was small.
he
he
could
was
have
a
been a
small
large
child.
child.
Yeah.
But my take, and then out of that, especially following the Luke one, is then not only did he say in deed, but then he did in action.
Yeah. Bobby, you got to take away.
So I don't think any of us would ever blatantly argue about this question. Like, Roy, I'm going to be better than you in the kingdom of heaven. I'm going to be more favored. But I think we have inclinations to this sort of selfishness, this worrying or caring more about what other people think of us than about what God thinks of us. And I think that's kind of his response, is to address that pride in the disciples in that moment, to tell them to humble themselves like this child. So my takeaway is to think about those times in my life where I am caring about elevating myself and glorifying myself instead of God.
Thanks. All right, so next week we'll continue our look at the life of Jesus, and we are getting closer. We're getting closer. You said that the next passage in Luke, immediately after this, is Jesus turning his eyes to Jerusalem, which is we're turning the page into a different phase of Jesus's life, leading to the crucifixion. So we hope you'll join us as we continue to examine this, and hope that our discussion and your reading of God's Word continues to pour into you. Thanks. Well, the Wanderers podcast is a series of the Collage podcasts produced at Feed My Sheep. Our panel includes Jenna Fox, Jeff Stiegel, Karen Smith, and myself, Roy Rhodes, with occasional guests from around our community. Our producer is Bobby Jeffers. Thank you for journeying with us as we wander through the stories of Scripture and wonder at God's redemptive work in Jesus.